Welcome to Chapter 13, the Endocrine System for the Human Biology students. Now, this is just the addendum to the previous video for the hormones, so make sure to watch the video that's has been done for a different class but in the same topic, the endocrine system. That video covers all the names of the hormones, the names of the glands, where they're located in the body. Now, just some additional information that we need to know for this class is that we want to talk about briefly some of the endocrine physiology and some of the disorders. Again, you will find all of this information in our chapter 13 in the human biology textbook. Now, very important to keep in mind here is that hormones are just basically small molecular messages that are sent by different organs, different cells throughout the body, and usually enter into the bloodstream, go at a distance to another target tissue, and then have their effects. Now, because there's so many different types of organs and different types of receptors that they bind to, it's important to recognize that there are steroid type and non-steroid type of hormones. That's a broad way to categorize most of them. Most of the hormones, again, are of the relatively simple variety. It might be just a few amino acids connected. It might be some other kind of molecule. And they're non-steroid type hormones. Again, these are the hormones that bind to the receptor on top of a cell membrane. And once they bind to that receptor, some kind of change undergoes with the receptor and it usually sends the signal into the cytoplasm and continues on to have its effect. Okay? If it's a steroid type hormone, the process is somewhat a little bit more complex, more involved. Essentially what happens is that instead of just simply binding to a receptor on the cell surface, after it binds, the receptor and the molecule actually gets incorporated and goes deeper through the cell into the nucleus and enters the nucleus and then binds to the DNA itself. So when that occurs, these are the steroid type hormones that do that. Again, there's a few of them as well. So thinking of like cortisol, testosterone, estrogens. These are usually hormones that have been using cholesterol as their molecular framework. Again, we call these steroid type hormones. They have long-term effects. They have more significant effects in the body because, again, they affect the transcription of the DNA. They bind to the nuclear DNA inside the nucleus of a cell. And the non-steroid hormones like thyroxine, like insulin, others, they also have often dramatic effects in the body, but again, they only bind at the cell surface mostly, and the receptors locating at the cell membrane instead of going deeper into the cell structure. Again, in the book, you'll see different examples and kind of the illustrations for that. Another important concept here is to keep in mind is that in order to make sure that the body is actually producing the hormones at the correct concentrations, doesn't produce too much or too little, we have all these different positive and negative feedback loops that have been established within the endocrine system. Very briefly, positive feedback loop essentially means that, for instance, when a molecule is sent to an organ, to a target tissue, it has its effect, but for some reason, the organ, the target tissue might say, okay, we actually need more hormone, send us more, we haven't received enough, and then another signal is sent back up to the original tissue, and that reinforces that signal, so it's positive feedback, and more hormone is released. Now, if it's negative feedback loop, the opposite happens, where essentially after the hormone messages have been sent, the hormonal messages have been sent to the target tissue, and adequate amount of hormone has been received there, the desirable effect has occurred, and the tissue then sends a signal, says, okay, now stop, that's enough, we received enough of this hormone, and there's that signal being sent back up saying, again, negative feedback, meaning please stop sending that hormone, right, so that tissue doesn't want to be overwhelmed with those chemicals. Again, for better kind of illustration of this, make sure to take a look in this chapter to see how that has been drawn in diagrams and pictures there in the book. And again, as we're going to talk about disorders very soon, it's possible for some hormones to be hypersecreted, meaning secreted in excess of their normal physiological amounts, or hyposecreted, meaning secreted in less than normal amounts. Okay, so this, again, could be done essentially on purpose, or very often in terms of clinical disorders, anything from a tumor hypersecreting a certain hormone, or in fact secreting less than normal. But all these different possibilities are there for the endocrine disorders. Again, hypersecretion means the gland is secreting more than normal amounts of the hormone, and hypersecretion means they're secreting less than normal amounts of the hormone. Now, what kind of common disorders do we have in this system? There's quite a lot of different endocrine disorders that exist. Here I'm illustrating just a few of the relatively more common ones, those that you might come across and that the author is mentioning in our book. Probably one of the most common endocrine disorders in the United States and in the world is diabetes mellitus. When you hear someone who has diabetes or problems with sugar control, this is what we're talking about. This is the full name of the disorder, diabetes mellitus. This is a very well-known, very common chronic disorder that affects, unfortunately, a very significant proportion of the population in the United States and in the world. There are two major types of diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2. Most of the people in the United States who are affected by this disorder actually have the type 2 version of the disorder. And so this one is the one that most predominant and most kind of important for us. And type 1 is less common, but still significant, obviously. Now, the main difference, the main problem with this disorder is that this is all about the hormone insulin, which is produced by the pancreatic islet cells in the digestive system. And insulin is an essential hormone for normal absorption of glucose and reduction of hyperglycemia in the blood. Essentially, after a meal, carbohydrates need to be broken down and absorbed. In order for glucose, which is a type of carbohydrate, to be absorbed into most cells in the body, insulin must be present. If insulin is not present, the glucose cannot enter the cells. Obviously, that damages cells because glucose is an essential energy molecule for a cell, and that causes a lot of problems. So in type 1 diabetes, the person's islet cells actually are not producing either not enough insulin or not at all, and so they must receive injections of insulin artificially because they need it to survive. Again, type 1 diabetes, this is the less common type. This is where a person essentially is born with a condition where, for whatever reason, their cells in the pancreas do not produce insulin. The much more common one now, the type 2 diabetes, is where insulin is produced at normal amounts in the beginning, but for whatever reason, the body develops resistance to insulin. So if the tissues are resistant to insulin, meaning the insulin is present in the bloodstream, but somehow cannot bind to the receptors so the cells don't recognize it, then the effects are essentially the same. The cells cannot get the glucose that they need, and they suffer because of that. Especially cells are affected, those are the blood vessels, capillaries, kidneys, and many other organs as well. Again, there is treatment for diabetes. This is a very big topic that I'm not going to be discussing here, but when you read it in the book, you'll see some additional information that's important. Another condition that sounds similar but is actually very different, diabetes insipidus. This is essentially dealing with a person who, for whatever reason, has decreased secretions of antidiuretic hormone. It's possible to have central diabetes insipidus or peripheral type. Regardless of the distinction, essentially, either the person is not producing enough ADH, or again, there's resistance in the body for ADH. Keep in mind, ADH is the hormone that has effects on collecting ducts in the kidneys and basically causes water retention. So if you do not have enough ADH, then that causes more water to be excreted by the body and essentially loss of water in excess. Again, decreased amounts of antidiuretic hormone. This is diabetes insipidus. These people are often very thirsty. They have polyuria, polydipsia, these kind of symptoms because of lack of ADH in the body. Another disorder that now has to do with the growth hormone. Again, it's possible to receive too much growth hormone or too little throughout a person's life. If a person receives too much growth hormone before the growth plates fuse, we call this gigantism, right? So the person grows to be very tall, very large. And if the excess growth hormone is secreted later, after the growth plates have fused, after the full skeleton has developed, we call this condition acromegaly. Acromegaly, again, refers to hypersecretion of growth hormone around the age of like 20 or later, when the growth plates have fused, and so the person is not going to become taller and bigger, but they will have facial changes. They often will complain not being able to wear their gloves anymore, their hats, right, because there's some expansion in the skull and bony features, things like that. Again, you have to see kind of very unique appearance for these patients, and the condition is called acromegaly. Another disorder now referring to the thyroid gland. So there are quite a lot of different disorders where either the thyroid is hypersecreting the T4, T3 hormones or hyposecreting those hormones. Now, in a condition where, because we remember that we need iodine to make normal thyroid hormones, if iodine is not adequately present in the diet, like it occurs in some countries in the world, especially in mountainous areas, it's very common to see a goiter, which is an enlargement in the neck. Basically, the thyroid gland starts to get bigger because essentially, since it's not getting the hormones, the tissue starts to kind of get enlarged. And so not enough iodine, rather, right? So not enough hormone, but the lack of iodine in the diet causes the thyroid gland not to be able to produce adequate amounts of the T4, T3 thyroid hormones, and that causes the enlargements in the gland, and again presents as a goiter. Now, the goiter usually does not have any kind of medical significance other than cosmetic problems, right? So it's not a tumor, it's not a cancer, potentially doesn't even hurt the patient, but again, it might become obstructive or uncomfortable, and definitely is a cosmetic issue for those affected. And the last disorder here is there are many different types of hypersecretion of the thyroid gland hormones. Hyperthyroidism is occurs for a different variety of reasons, and autoimmune type of hyperthyroidism is actually considered one of the most common types of hyperthyroidism that exists, and we call this Graves' disease. This is a condition where a person has protruding eyes, which we call exophthalmos. They might or might not have a goiter in their neck. They usually have other symptoms associated with hyperthyroidism, such as changes in their hair. They have, remember, hypersecretion for thyroid hormones means everything is up, so they have sweaty skins, they have tremors, they have diarrhea of the digestive tract, they often have palpitations, nervousness, and other effects. Again, so essentially putting all the symptoms of hyperthyroidism, only you keeping in mind this is autoimmune condition, meaning this is effect from the immune system attacking essentially the normal thyroid cells and having these kind of effect. This is a fairly common condition. We do have some treatment available for this. Again, to learn more about this, read about thyroid abnormalities in our textbook. Again, make sure to review all of this information for the endocrine chapter.